when Alice gave birth to her daughter Emma. She had already been juggling a demanding full-time job as a nurse and a modest yet stable life with her husband, Ryan. They lived in a small, two-bedroom home in the suburbs of Denver, a place where neighbors still waved from driveways and kids rode bikes down the sidewalk until the streetlights came on. The couple had married 3 years earlier in a quiet ceremony, and while Alice had no surviving parents of her own, she felt comforted knowing that Ryan's mother, Barbara, welcomed her into the family like her own daughter. Barbara was, by all appearances, the ideal mother-in-law. She was cheerful, polite, and always had a home-cooked casserole ready for family dinners. She lived just 15 minutes away in a condo community reserved for retirees and never missed an opportunity to help. When Alice returned from the hospital after giving birth, it was Barbara who arrived with a trunk full of folded baby clothes, frozen meals, and a homemade rocking chair that had supposedly belonged to Ryan's great-grandmother. It wasn't glamorous, but to Alice, the support felt invaluable. 2 months into Alice's maternity leave, Barbara offered to babysit full-time. "You don't need to put Emma in daycare," she insisted with a warm smile. "Let me help. I've raised 2 kids, and I'd love nothing more than to be here while she grows up." Alice hesitated at first. While grateful, she didn't want to impose or blur lines. But with daycare expenses running upwards of $1,200 a month, and her nursing salary barely covering the mortgage and bills, the offer felt too generous to pass up. Ryan encouraged it too. He had grown up in a household where his mom was a constant presence, and he trusted her completely. Before Alice returned to work, they arranged everything carefully. Barbara would come over at 7:30 a.m., just as Alice left for her shift, and stay until 3 or 4 p.m. when Ryan returned from the office. To make things easier, Alice gave her a copy of the house key, the garage code, and even a spare key to their mailbox so she could bring in the post while they were gone. There was no formal contract, just love and trust between family members. At first, everything seemed perfect. Barbara treated Emma like royalty, taking her on stroller walks around the block, reading to her from vintage children's books, and sending Alice daily photo updates. "Your little lady just smiled at me while I hummed her to sleep," one message would read, followed by another. "She reached for my necklace today. So curious already." Alice's colleagues were envious. "You're lucky," one said during a lunch break. "My mother-in-law won't even return my texts." Another chimed in, "And daycare? Don't get me started. Half of my paycheck goes to strangers." Alice agreed. She did feel lucky. The years passed quickly. Emma grew into a clever, chatty 5-year-old with her grandmother's curly auburn hair. Barbara remained involved, though her full-time babysitting slowed as Emma started preschool. Still, she often popped by to drop off groceries or bake cookies. She was the type of grandmother who seemed too good to be true. And then came the house. Alice and Ryan had been discussing a move for over a year. Their little 2-bedroom was feeling cramped, and they wanted more space, especially since Alice was considering trying for a second child. They'd saved diligently and decided it was time to apply for a mortgage. Alice, always the planner, took charge of the paperwork. She gathered pay stubs, tax returns, bank statements, and filled out the online pre-approval form with confidence. They had no major debts apart from the car loan, and their credit cards were paid off regularly. She clicked submit and expected good news in a few days. But instead of approval, she received a rejection email. Confused, she double-checked the figure she had submitted. Everything matched. She assumed it had to be an error in the system. Curious and a bit anxious, she requested a copy of her full credit report through a consumer credit bureau. When the document arrived 3 days later, Alice sat in stunned silence as she scanned line after line of transactions that made no sense. There were 5 credit cards opened under her name, none of which she recognized. One from a department store she had never shopped at, another with a credit union based in a different state. All of them had balances ranging from $800 to $5,000. One had gone to collections. Some accounts had been opened as far back as 2018, around the time Emma had been born. Alice stared at the report like it was in another language. How was this possible? She was meticulous with her credit. She checked her scores every few months through her bank app. But somehow these accounts had slipped through, hidden in plain sight. The addresses for the bills were hers. The social security number was hers. Yet she'd never seen a single piece of mail or charge that indicated any of these cards existed. She called Ryan into the room. He read the report carefully, then looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Are you sure this isn't identity theft?" he asked. "Maybe someone got your information online?" Alice nodded slowly. "It has to be," she replied, though something deep inside her chest didn't feel convinced. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, revisiting the last few years, the time she had received oddly addressed junk mail, the statements that were missing from their usual delivery schedule, the few packages she had assumed were ordered by Ryan or perhaps misdelivered. And then she remembered the mailbox key. It was such a small thing. Barbara had offered to check the mail on days when Alice was working double shifts. She had said it so casually, "Might as well grab your mail while I'm here," that Alice never questioned it. She sat up in bed, eyes wide. Could it be? The next morning, Alice quietly pulled all recent mail from the box and combed through it. Nothing suspicious, but that wasn't enough. She decided to look further, calling each credit card company listed on her report, one by one, and requesting records. Most were cooperative, noting that if fraud was suspected, she had the right to see any documents used to open the account. When the first document arrived by email, an application form filled out by hand, Alice's breath caught. The handwriting was familiar. Slanted loops, rounded OS. It looked eerily like Barbara's notes on the Christmas cards she always left on the mantel. Still, it wasn't enough to accuse anyone. Not yet. Alice needed more. She requested original billing addresses, IP addresses from online applications, and any utility bills or IDs used as supporting documents. Over the following weeks, more damning pieces fell into place. A Verizon bill was used to verify identity. The address? Alice's. The name on it? Barbara M. Another card listed a backup phone number belonging to Barbara's cell. Alice's hands trembled as she printed out each page and laid them side by side across the dining table. Her eyes scanned them until there was no doubt left. Someone had stolen her identity, and that someone had access to her home, her personal documents, and her trust, and that someone was family. But what shook her most wasn't the violation. It was the timing. The fraud began just as Barbara started babysitting Emma full-time, when a mailbox key changed hands. That realization was the first crack in a relationship Alice once considered rock solid. And the worst part? She hadn't even begun to confront what came next. She just knew one thing. Her life, her credit, her trust, her sense of safety had been compromised. And the person who did it still hugged her daughter every Sunday. It was time to find out just how far Barbara had gone. Alice had always believed that trust, once broken, was impossible to fully restore. But she never imagined she'd have to test that belief with her own mother-in-law. The evidence she had gathered so far weighed heavily on her chest. She wanted to scream, to confront Barbara immediately, to shake answers out of her. But she also knew that if she acted without caution, the consequences could spiral beyond her control. Barbara was still around Emma regularly. She was still a central figure in their lives. And most of all, she was Ryan's mother. Accusing her without airtight proof could fracture the family. So instead, Alice chose to observe, document, and build her case methodically, because deep down, she knew she wasn't wrong. The first thing Alice did was stop leaving Emma alone with Barbara. She gave vague excuses, scheduling conflicts, a new routine, Emma's increasing independence. Anything to keep them apart without raising suspicion. Barbara noticed, but didn't push. "Kids grow up fast," she'd sigh, brushing it off. "Soon she won't need any of us." Alice nodded, playing along, her insides twisting. Alice spent evenings combing through old emails and documents, hunting for patterns she might have missed. She logged into every bank account, every digital portal, double-checking for security breaches or unusual access. She even ran background checks on the phone numbers tied to the accounts, most of which led back to Barbara's retirement complex or the disposable phone she once used only in emergencies. The most disturbing discovery, however, came from a neighbor. Alice was walking Emma home from school when she ran into Miss Dillard, their elderly neighbor from 2 doors down. They exchanged pleasantries, and as Emma skipped ahead, Miss Dillard said casually, "Haven't seen your mother-in-law picking up the mail lately. She used to come by almost every afternoon when you were working." Alice's face stiffened. "Did she?" she asked, trying to sound surprised without sounding alarmed. "Oh, yes," Miss Dillard replied, nodding. "She said you asked her to check the porch while you were on night shifts. Sometimes she'd even stop to chat with my cat on the front steps." Alice thanked her politely, masking the panic that had begun to rise in her throat. That wasn't just occasional help. That was routine surveillance of her home. She wondered how many packages, letters, statements, or notifications Barbara had intercepted over the years without her knowing. The next day, Alice installed a discreet motion-activated camera just above the mailbox and another facing the front door. She didn't tell Ryan. Not yet. She still wasn't ready to admit out loud that she suspected his mother of long-term financial deception. Instead, she focused on getting more evidence. Within 2 days, the camera caught Barbara approaching the house mid-afternoon, long after Alice and Ryan had left for work. She didn't ring the bell. She walked directly to the mailbox, used a key, and sorted through the envelopes like it was second nature. Then she slipped them into her purse and left. Alice replayed the footage 3 times. It was her, calm, unhurried, and utterly entitled. She hadn't come to visit Emma or check in. She'd come to retrieve mail. The act wasn't accidental or momentary. It was practiced, habitual. By now, Alice's suspicion had hardened into certainty. But she still didn't know the full scope. How many cards had been opened? How much debt had been racked up under her name? What had been purchased? To find out, she filed a formal fraud report with all 3 major credit bureaus. She also contacted each of the banks associated with the fraudulent cards and began the agonizing process of verifying identity theft. Many required notarized statements, copies of her driver's license, signed affidavits, and in some cases, even police reports. She gathered everything meticulously. The hardest part was acting normal around Ryan. He had noticed her restlessness, the late nights, the extra cups of coffee, the way she barely smiled at dinner anymore. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, he asked her gently, "Is something going on?" Alice looked at him for a long time. Her heart begged her to speak, but her brain urged caution. "I'm just tired," she said finally. "Work's been overwhelming, and I'm stressed about the mortgage stuff." He accepted it, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. Still, he didn't press. He trusted her, just as she had once trusted his mother. Then came the day she received an unexpected call from a collections agency. The woman on the other end of the line asked for Alice by her full name, then launched into a routine notice about a $2,700 balance on a card issued by a retail chain in Colorado Springs. Alice had never lived in Colorado Springs. The agent insisted the purchases had been verified: high-end furniture, home electronics, and a payment plan for a dental procedure. Alice felt her stomach drop. Furniture? Dental procedures? The total purchases were too personal to be random. She asked for the dates and delivery address. The woman complied. The items had been delivered to a P.O. box associated with an apartment unit that sounded familiar. After a quick search, Alice confirmed it. The address matched a property Barbara used to rent before moving to her current retirement condo. That was the final straw. She printed every invoice, highlighted every relevant detail, and laid the documents out across the dining room table like a detective working a cold case. Then she picked up the phone and called a lawyer. The attorney, a calm, older woman named Sharon Wallace, listened intently as Alice explained everything. She didn't react with shock or pity, just quiet, professional understanding. "Family fraud happens more often than people think," Sharon said. "The emotional damage is often worse than the financial. But the good news is you've been smart. You documented everything, and we can absolutely build a case." Alice's voice trembled. "But what if you didn't mean to hurt us? What if she just needed help?" Sharon's tone remained steady. "Intent doesn't change the impact. She committed a crime, and whether you want to pursue criminal charges or just civil recovery, that's your decision. But the first step is filing a police report." So Alice did. She drove to the local station the next day, clutching a file folder like it held her dignity. The officer who took her statement asked questions gently, trying to avoid adding to her obvious distress. The moment she signed the form declaring Barbara a suspect in identity theft, she felt a sickening sense of betrayal settle in her chest. She returned home, unsure how to tell Ryan. She didn't sleep that night. Her thoughts spun like a carousel. Would he believe her? Would he defend his mother? Would this destroy their marriage? The next morning, she found him in the kitchen pouring cereal for Emma. He looked up and smiled, unaware that everything was about to change. "Ryan," she said softly, "we need to talk. It's about your mom." He froze. What happened? Alice took a deep breath, then opened the folder and laid out the evidence. The credit reports, the signed applications, the utility bills, the camera photos. At first, he stared in disbelief. Then denial crept into his face. No, she wouldn't do this. There has to be a mistake. Maybe someone used her name, too. Maybe. "Ryan," Alice interrupted gently. "The camera caught her. She's been going through our mailbox for years. These purchases were delivered to her old address. Her phone number was listed. Her handwriting is all over the forms." He didn't respond. For a long time, they sat in silence, Emma's laughter echoing from the living room, oblivious to the storm brewing in the kitchen. Finally, Ryan said, "I need to talk to her." Alice nodded. "Just be careful. Don't tell her I filed anything yet. Let her talk first." What came next would challenge everything they thought they knew about family. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about deception, loyalty, and what it meant to protect the ones you love, even when the threat came from within. Ryan stared at the folder of evidence long after Alice had walked out of the kitchen to give him space. The cereal in his bowl had gone soggy. His hands hovered over the papers as though touching them might make the truth vanish. He had always believed his mother to be a strong, if sometimes overbearing, woman. She was the one who held their family together after his father died when he was a teenager. She was dependable, organized, and emotionally distant in a way that he had long interpreted as stoicism rather than control. But now, staring at proof of fraud, deception, and betrayal, all carefully documented by his wife, he began to question every memory. He didn't tell Alice what he was going to do. He simply got into his car and drove the 15 minutes to Barbara's retirement condo. The community was peaceful, almost sterile, with trimmed hedges and beige siding. The sun was low in the sky as he parked outside and approached her front door. She opened it within seconds, already smiling. "Ryan, what a surprise. Everything okay?" He stepped in, declining her offer of coffee, and sat down on the familiar beige sofa in the living room. It was the same couch from his childhood home, comfortable, worn, and now impossible to look at without feeling unsettled. "I need to ask you something," Ryan said without preamble. His voice was low and careful, the way it used to be when he broke bad news to patients during his residency. Barbara raised a curious eyebrow. "Of course. What's wrong? Did you open credit cards in Alice's name?" For a moment, there was no reaction. No sulk. No denial. Just an eerie stillness, like the air had left the room. Barbara's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "Mom," he pressed, "I need you to be honest with me. Don't lie. Please." She let out a long breath and looked away, focusing on the corner of the room where Emma's first finger painting still hung in a dollar store frame. "I didn't think it would get this far," she said finally, voice almost a whisper. Ryan felt like he'd been punched. "So it's true?" Barbara nodded slowly. "I was going to pay it back. I was just in a difficult place, and I didn't know who else to turn to." He couldn't process her calmness. "You stole her identity. You stole from your own family. From me. From Emma." "I didn't see it that way at the time," she said defensively, sitting straighter. "You two were doing fine. Alice had a good job. You were always busy. I thought it wasn't going to hurt anyone." Ryan's voice broke. "You thought it wouldn't hurt anyone? Do you understand what you've done? You ruined her credit. You violated her privacy. You went through our mail, our lives." Barbara's expression hardened. "Don't you dare act like I haven't given everything to this family. I raised you on my own. I watched your daughter every day for years. I made sure your house didn't fall apart when Alice was too exhausted to care. I was there when you couldn't be. And that gave you the right to steal? I didn't steal, she snapped. I borrowed. Borrowed? He echoed, incredulous. You used her social security number. You opened cards in her name. You maxed them out and ignored the bills. That's not borrowing, Mom. That's fraud. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes watered. For the first time, she looked small, fragile, like the aging woman she was. I was drowning, Ryan. After the surgery, I couldn't keep up with my bills. The insurance only covered half. I didn't want to come to you because you were already juggling so much. So I thought I could manage it on my own. I only needed a little help to get through. But instead of asking, he said quietly, you took. From the woman I love. There was no coming back from that. Ryan stood up. Alice filed a police report, he said. She has everything documented. I didn't stop her because I couldn't. And I won't. Barbara flinched. She's pressing charges? Not yet, he said. But she's within her rights too. And you should know, there's a lawyer involved now. You need to get one too. Barbara's eyes filled with panic. Ryan, please. You can fix this. Talk to her. I'll sign whatever I need to. I'll pay it all back. It's not about money anymore, he replied, his voice firm. It's about trust. And you shattered it. He left without another word. When he returned home, Alice was pacing in the living room. She stopped when she saw his face, pale, angry, exhausted. She admitted it, he said simply. Alice nodded slowly. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt sick. I told her you filed a report, he added. She's going to get a lawyer. She says she'll pay it back. She can't fix this with money, Alice murmured. That's not what this is about. They sat in silence for a while. Then Ryan said something Alice hadn't expected. I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days. She looked up. Why? Because I need time to figure out what this means for us. For me. I love you, Alice. I support you. But I don't know how to process this. That my mother could do something so cruel. Alice nodded slowly. I get it. I do. The next day, Barbara's lawyer reached out to Alice's attorney to discuss a potential restitution agreement. Barbara wanted to avoid criminal charges by entering a legal repayment plan and formally admitting fault in a signed statement. Sharon, Alice's lawyer, reviewed the offer and laid out the conditions. Full financial restitution within 5 years, removal of Barbara's access to any property or accounts, and a written apology. In exchange, Alice would agree to drop criminal charges, though the civil fraud report would remain on file with credit bureaus. Alice didn't respond immediately. She needed to think. Her heart ached for Emma, who adored her grandmother. She also felt conflicted about Ryan, who was torn between the two women in his life. And somewhere deep inside, she questioned if forgiveness was even possible in a case like this. A week passed. Alice returned to work, threw herself into long shifts, and kept her mind busy. Ryan called every night to check on Emma, but didn't come home. On the 8th day, he asked to meet in person. They sat at the same park bench where they had first talked about having children years ago. He looked thinner, more tired. She wore no makeup and hadn't slept well. I'm not defending her, Ryan said. What she did was raw and disgusting. But I've had time to think, and I realized I don't want this to destroy us. Alice looked at him, waiting. I want to help you rebuild your credit, he continued. I want to make this right. Not for her. For us. Tears welled in Alice's eyes. You didn't do this. But she's my family, he said, and I need to take responsibility for the ripple effects. Alice squeezed his hand. Then we do it together. They agreed to sign the restitution deal, but made it clear there would be no reconciliation. Barbara was cut off entirely. No unsupervised contact with Emma. No keys, no access. When Barbara received the news, she didn't fight it. She signed the papers, submitted her first payment, and sent a 1-page handwritten letter of apology. Alice read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. The confrontation had ended, but the recovery was just beginning. And while some wounds heal with time, others leave scars that serve as permanent reminders of what was lost and what was saved. The months that followed the confrontation were filled with quiet changes and emotional recalibrations. Alice often likened it to waking up in a house that looked exactly the same as before, only to discover that the foundation had shifted beneath her feet. Nothing had fallen, not yet, but every step felt unstable. Every room held a memory slightly tainted by what she now knew. She had been violated not by a stranger or a criminal hiding behind a screen, but by someone who sat at her dinner table, someone who had held her newborn child and called her daughter. The restitution agreement with Barbara was formalized swiftly after Ryan and Alice met at the park. Alice's lawyer, Sharon Wallace, structured the terms with surgical precision. Barbara was to pay back every dollar charged under Alice's name over a 5-year period. The total, after interest and legal fees, came to $46,000. Barbara agreed to the payment plan without objection, but it was clear she was doing it for Ryan, not for Alice. The letter of apology had been stiff and impersonal, a formality rather than a gesture of remorse. Alice didn't expect more. What she hadn't expected, however, was how difficult it would be to live with the knowledge that her personal information was still floating out there in systems she could no longer control. Every time she received a letter from a bank or got an email about account security, her chest tightened. She changed all her passwords, placed a credit freeze on her accounts, and paid for monthly credit monitoring. Even then, a sense of violation lingered. Ryan returned home after 3 weeks, carrying his duffel bag in one hand and a bouquet of white tulips in the other. Alice had always preferred tulips to roses. When he stepped through the door, Emma ran into his arms, shrieking with joy, and for a brief moment, things felt whole again. But rebuilding wasn't as simple as moving back in. They attended therapy together, first once a week, then every other week. The therapist, a gentle but firm woman named Corinne, asked hard questions. How did Alice feel about Ryan's hesitation? Did Ryan still carry guilt for what his mother had done? Could Alice forgive not just Barbara, but the version of herself that hadn't seen this coming? Forgiveness wasn't linear. Some days, Alice felt light enough to believe they were healing. Other days, she'd see a forgotten piece of mail on the counter and her stomach would churn. On more than one occasion, she found herself replaying Barbara's words in her head. I didn't think it would get this far, and wondering if that had been the plan all along. To take just a little, then a little more, until she couldn't stop. Ryan, to his credit, didn't defend his mother anymore. He stopped visiting her, communicating only through their lawyers. At first, Alice wondered if he resented her for that. But when he quietly removed Barbara's framed photo from the hallway and replaced it with a picture of Emma's last school recital, she understood that he had made his choice. Life moved on, but not without permanent adjustments. Alice's credit slowly began to recover. With help from Sharon and a few letters of explanation, she managed to secure a second-chance mortgage lender, though the interest rate was higher than expected. They purchased a modest 3-bedroom home on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, but theirs. Moving into a new space felt symbolic, a fresh chapter written on clean pages. The first night they slept there, Alice lay awake for hours listening to the silence, feeling both relieved and haunted. Emma adjusted quickly. She was too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but old enough to notice that Grandma Barbara wasn't around anymore. At first, she asked questions. Is Grandma mad at me? Did I do something wrong? Alice and Ryan answered gently, explaining that sometimes adults make mistakes, and those mistakes have consequences. They never lied, but they didn't expose her to the ugliness either. They told her the truth in a way she could hold. That love should never come with secrets. The bigger challenge was how to repair Alice's sense of security, not just financial, but emotional. She began writing again, something she hadn't done since college. Journaling helped her articulate the anger and betrayal she couldn't say aloud. Over time, those entries transformed into essays, which she published anonymously on a blog about financial abuse and identity theft within families. To her surprise, the blog took off. Comments poured in. People who had suffered similarly, who had been conned by siblings, partners, parents. Reading their stories made her feel less alone, and sharing hers gave her a strange sense of agency. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor telling the story on her own terms. Barbara continued to make monthly restitution payments. The checks were routed through the legal office, and Alice never touched or deposited them directly. Ryan opened a separate account, used exclusively to hold the restitution funds until the full amount was paid. They agreed it would eventually go toward Emma's college tuition, a quiet form of justice. 5 months after the final terms were signed, Alice received a call from Barbara's lawyer. Barbara had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. The lawyer delicately asked if there could be any amendment to the visitation terms, perhaps supervised visits with Emma, considering her condition. Alice didn't answer immediately. She hung up, sat at the dining room table, and stared at her reflection in the window for what felt like an hour. Then she poured a glass of water, took a breath, and called Ryan. They sat together that night, weighing the morality of the decision against the rawness of the betrayal. Emma didn't know the full story. She didn't know her grandmother had betrayed her parents. She only knew that she missed the woman who used to braid her hair and sneak her candy when Alice wasn't looking. "I don't want to teach our daughter that forgiveness is easy," Alice said slowly. "But I also don't want to teach her that people can never change." So they agreed on a plan. Barbara would be allowed to see Emma once a month at a neutral location, under the supervision of both parents. The first visit was strained. Barbara looked older, her hands trembling slightly as she held Emma's drawing in her lap. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice cracked. Emma, in her innocence, hugged her tightly, unaware of the war that had taken place behind the scenes. As the months passed, the visits became part of a new rhythm. Alice never forgot, but over time, she stopped expecting an apology that would never come. She focused instead on the life she was rebuilding, with more boundaries, more awareness, but also more strength. 3 years later, Alice stood on a stage at a local conference on cybersecurity and personal finance, reading an excerpt from her blog. Her story had been featured in a national magazine, and she was now a recognized voice in discussions around familial financial fraud. She had turned pain into purpose, betrayal into education. Ryan sat in the audience, Emma beside him, holding a bouquet of yellow tulips. Alice looked up, smiled, and concluded her talk with the words she had learned to live by. "You cannot always choose what's done to you, but you can choose who you become because of it." As the room filled with applause, she felt something shift, not the foundation, but the air. Lighter now, clearer, because even when trust breaks and the damage is deep, it is still possible to build something better on the other side. And that, Alice now knew, was where healing truly begins.